First Days Amongst the Contrabands by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 6 My Parish. The poor ye have always with you. This was impressed upon me all the time. It was necessary to inspect my district, now crowded with newcomers, to find out the condition and needs of these people. I went first to the Negro Quarters at the Battery Plantation, a mile and a half away. A large number of Georgia refugees who had followed Sherman's army were quartered here. Around the old plantation house was a small army of black children who swarmed like bees around a hive. There were 6 rooms in the house, occupied by 31 persons, big and little. In one room was a man whom I had seen before. He was very light, with straight red hair and a sandy complexion, and I mistook him for an Irishman. He had been to me at one time grieving deeply for the loss of his wife, but he had now consoled himself with a buxom girl as black as ink. His sister, a splendidly developed creature, was with them. He had also 4 sons. 2 were as light as himself, and 2 were very black. These 7 persons occupied this one room. A rough box bedstead, with a layer of moss and a few old rags in it, a hominy pot, 2 or 3 earthen plates, and a broken-backed chair, comprised all the furniture of the room. I had previously given one of the women a needle and some thread, and she now sat on the edge of the rough bedstead trying to sew the dress she ought, in decency, to have had on. In the old kitchen, not far from the house, more refugees had been placed. 2 women were very ill, lying on the floor with only moss and corn husks under them. It was a most pitiful sight. One of these women begged for a blanket, but the other asked for better food. "I cannot eat only dry hominy, ma'am," she said. "I lived in Mass's house, and used to have white bread and coffee, and I want something sweet in my mouth." She had belonged to kind and careful owners in Georgia, and suffered severely from all these changes. The dialect of these people was very different from the speech of the islanders. They spoke clearly and distinctly. Both of these women died. Feeling they could not live, to my surprise and consternation, they willed me their children. In one family there were 5 children, and in the other but 1 boy. The old feeling, born of slavery, that the white race had a right of possession over the blacks, still clung to them. They not only gave me their children, but tried to exact from me a promise to keep them and take good care of them. When I hesitated, they implored me most piteously not to desert them. 3 of these children died not long after the mother, and I am happy to say the others were well placed. In time, one of the boys was married, on which occasion I gave him a suit of second-hand clothing and a long chapter of good advice. He bowed and laughed merrily, thinking much of the clothing, and I hope a little of the advice. The plantation people lived in the nigger houses. Most of these people had been carried up country by their old owners, but had now got back, delighted to see again the familiar places and the cabins where they were born. They seemed to me, as I talked with them, a superior class. more tidy and self-respecting than most of the newcomers, owing, doubtless, to the care and good management of their former owners. On the next plantation was a curious collection of the original people and newcomers. All might be called refugees, for they had recently returned from the Main, where they had been carried, not fled to. In one cabin I found a man in a most wretched condition. Years before he had fallen from a building and broken his back. In the vicissitudes of war he was left alone and destitute, a most repulsive object, 1,000 times worse off than a caged animal cared for by his keeper. He was grateful for the few scraps thrown him like a dog in his kennel. He was only able to use his hands, and he looked like a human ball rolling over the floor. I had his cabin cleaned and whitewashed, and fresh, clean clothes put on the poor fellow. He tried in vain to find words to express his gratitude. In all my interviews with him, I never heard a word of complaint, although his sufferings must have been extreme. "Bless the Lord, missus," he said. "'Tain't no use to fret about it, for it can't be helped. And I ain't all the time so racket about wid pain as I used to been. Sometimes at night I's so painful I can't shet my eye, and den I look out de door, up at the stars, and tink dem de eyes of de Lord looking straight down at me one. And I 'member what de white folks tell me, de Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. For in course I is his little sheep, and I is so glad. It 'pears like the pain don't hurt me no more. I done forget it altogether." Oh, blessed faith, which can brighten and cheer such a wretched life! Often, in deep humility, have I thought of these disciples, poor and despised of men, but rich in these treasures of divine faith and love. One woman in that neighborhood was called Titty Sugar. She had a little boy and girl named Manassas and Autty. Another woman, whose husband was in the army, came to the school. She said, "I used to live in town with Mrs. in old Secesh times," and she evidently considered herself superior to the people around her. To my question, she said, "Don't know how old I is, but specks I isn't a chicken." Indeed, she looked quite like an old hen. She was eager "to learn her book," and she succeeded very well. There was a colony of Georgia refugees at Fort Charlotte, about 2 miles from the schoolhouse. They were an unusually intelligent and self-respecting class. In my district there were over 500 contrabands, men, women, and children. All expressed a desire to have their children learn something if they themselves knew nothing. But all, from the oldest to the youngest, were eager to "come for larn too." I found but one person, a young soldier, who disdained to attempt anything, saying, almost with insolence, that he had a right to learn when young, like other boys. This was denied him then, and he was not allowed to touch a book, and now it was too late. This man had indomitable will, with boldness, unceasing activity, and great physical strength. He was a power with his race. I wished to gain his influence for the school, as well as his own good, but could never do it. One contraband said to me, "Liberty is as good for us as for the birds of the air. Slavery is not so bad, but liberty is so good." He spoke with great affection of his master, who he said had gone to live in Delaware. One bright, cool morning, the superintendent and I crossed the river to Cat and Cane Islands. We were paddled over in a dugout managed by two black boys, Renty and Elijah, who laughed and sang all the time, showing the whitest of white teeth. We were met and cordially welcomed by a middle-aged black woman who was evidently watching for us, having seen the boat leave the opposite shore. She had always been house servant and dairy woman, and was intelligent and tidy. The house servants and field hands were like two different races. She escorted us through the town, as she called the Negro Quarters, and gave a clear and highly entertaining history of the people living there. The old plantation house had been burned, and no white person lived on the island. The children had learned nothing, and were very eager to have a school. All the people clamored for this, and begged me to come over and teach them. One woman said, "Oh, missus, us want to larn mighty bad. Us ain't had no school, but us'll do anything if you'll come over and larn we." They offered to fix up the old cotton barn for a schoolhouse. That was the best they could do, and to send a boat daily to carry a teacher back and forth. But this could not be done. The small, insecure boats on this broad river, which is an arm of the sea, with the uncertainty of the weather, made the whole plan impracticable. I promised to do what I could for them. For a time they tried to cross the river daily, but finally many families moved to our side to catch education. The Negro houses on these islands were better built and better arranged than any I had seen before. Around each was a yard for pigs and poultry, and a piece of ground was fenced in for a garden. They had a refreshing air of cleanliness and comfort. These islands had not been devastated and laid waste like those on the opposite shore. One old woman seemed overjoyed to see a white person once more. She bitterly bewailed her poverty, because she had not something, not even an egg or some ground nuts, to put into my hands. She evidently mistook me for her old mistress returned, and wanted to know how I had been all this long time, and how all my folks were. Then she begged me for just one needle and a bit of thread to patch her old coat with. Her old husband was called Daddy Snicker. They all thought he was not too old to learn. The Negro Quarters consisted of 2 rows of very small houses, built one each side of a narrow road, which was not much more than a footpath. The quarters the Negroes called a town, and the path a street. One woman who called her boy Bone said he should come to school if she had to bring him herself. Another woman assured me her children could learn well, for both have very good tongues. The history of those days can never be written. In each small neighborhood were romances, comedies, and tragedies. In times of trouble, the Contrabands always came to their teachers for help and advice. Sometimes we were much embarrassed to know what to say or do. When I saw their implicit confidence in our knowledge and sympathy, I found it very hard to tell them I could do nothing. A sick woman came to me one day who was suffering from a serious organic trouble. After listening to her story and getting all the facts, I said, "Auntie, that is beyond me. I really do not know what to do for you." Her look of astonishment and dismay was really startling, as she exclaimed, "Oh, missus, you can read books, and in course you knows more'n we." Yes, I could read books, but they did not tell me everything. In fact, I soon discovered they told me very little of what I needed to know most. The new bell. I had expressed a wish for a bell for my schoolhouse, hoping to bring about a more regular attendance with less delay. Immediately a Boston friend, who had been in the department, responded by sending me just what I needed. Oh, what a delight was this bell to the whole neighborhood! The children would collect around the house very early, and lie on the ground waiting and watching for it to ring. For a long time this was a mystery incomprehensible to them. They talked often to each other about "wee bell," and seemed to feel as if each one had a kind of right of possession in it. "Oh, but him can talk loud," said the boys with delight. I told them all what the bell was for, where it came from, and who sent it. Without consulting me, they immediately named the school for our generous friend, Hooper School A No. 1. The children were allowed to take turns in ringing the bell, but this was a privilege only granted as a reward for good behavior. Hooper School. After New Year's, which is always the Negro's special holiday, school began again in earnest. Early every morning the children crowded my piazza. I asked them what time they started from home. One said, "At first crack o' day." Another said, "The day had clean done broke when I left we house, but I run every step of the way." The children talked of we school as Hooper Bell School. The men and women who had been enrolled and then waited to get in their taters, saying, "When we get in our tings, we sure to come," were on hand. It was often dark before we closed our schoolroom doors, for the days were short, and there was no twilight. We had school on Saturdays so as to keep up the habit of regular attendance. This was especially Children's Day, as the older people announced they had work to do, which usually meant to take foot to Beaufort, to see what was going on. One fearfully cold day I went to the schoolhouse early and had a rousing fire built before anyone came. Only a few of the older scholars ventured out, and by the time they arrived I was nearly congealed. It was no more possible to heat the unsealed and open house than it would be the open grove. Besides, the smoke, which should have gone out of the windows, blew back into the room until we were nearly suffocated. Under these circumstances, I dismissed the children and went away, greatly to their surprise and regret. "Us'll be so lonesome if us go away," they said. Often our room was filled to overflowing with men, women, and children. Miss Fanny had come fresh from school, full of zeal, and with many theories for the advancement of the Contrabands. But this was an unexplored field, requiring a line of action not mapped out in any book. All attempts at precise order and orthodox discipline quenched the ardor of her pupils and set their wits astray. "Attention, children," said she, and they stared hopelessly at her, and not an answer could she get to any question. I saw her color rise, and a look of intense weariness come over her before the morning's work was done. "They are hopelessly stupid," she exclaimed as we started on our homeward walk. "How have you endured this so long?" "Wait a little and see. Don't expect too much of them or of yourself," was my answer. The next day was not much better, but she became encouraged. "Tomorrow I shall begin over again. I see we do not understand each other," she said. After that she had everything her own way. It was charming to see the welcome all gave her. The brightness of youth is very attractive to these universal children who never seem to grow old. There was a good deal of rivalry in the classes, and not a little good-natured joking and boasting amongst the scholars. Every one was eager to learn something. We soon began to see an improvement in the condition of the scholars, with a degree of order and cleanliness. If any were absent, they sent excuses like the following: "Please, ma'am, Pa Smart and Titty say they'm can't come to school today, fur dem gone to bury one of Mass's niggers. Him dead at butcher pen." The writing of this note on a piece of paper bag was evidently the combined effort of the whole family. A man and his wife stood together in a class to read. They were great stalwart creatures, black as ink. Their 3 children were in the class above them, having conquered words of one syllable. As soon as the parents began to read, the children simultaneously darted to their sides to prompt them. "Boy, Daddy, boy! Him don't know nothing," laughingly said Dick, prompting him. "Shut you mouth, boy. I only want to catch dat word, sure," the pleased father answered, scratching his head. "Dem chillun too smart. I ain't know what to do wid dem," declared the proud mother. Their boys, Dick and London, were the same size, and the veriest little ragamuffins that could be found. Each wore a shirt and old pants minus buttons, one suspender, a piece fastened with a rusty nail in place of a pin. Behold their entire outfit. One day they had an old hat, minus the brim, between them, but this soon came to grief. A gust of wind took it off, so they let it go. They always stood in the class with an arm around each other's neck. The other hand was used to hitch up their pants. The one that was reading always stammered and hesitated over the simplest words, while the other prompted, knowing the lesson by heart. But when he tried to read, he stammered in the same way. They evidently learned by proxy. Their sister Jane was no better off than they, while she was far more uncouth. We patiently struggled to teach her to sew and to bring about cleanliness and a degree of order. One day she was fitted out with an entire suit of good clothing, but in a few days she was just as badly off as before. About this time the cotton was sold, and she appeared in the schoolroom with an astonishing new hat on her head. It was a white straw with a bunch of red, blue, and green rooster's tail feathers standing straight up. Her feet were bare, and her frock ragged and dirty, but she walked into the room with the air of a queen. "Jane, take off your hat and hang it up." "Dem chillun gwine to teef it ef I lef him out dar," was her reply. Quite different from them was a Combi woman who came to school daily with a baby in her arms and two boys by her side. They all stood up to read together. These families were refugees. They have all returned to their old homes on the mainland. Primus, one of the boys, has become a teacher and a preacher, and is the wise man of that neighborhood. His mother comes to see me once a year and tells with pride of her boy's position, always speaking of him as an A1 scholar. Mein child. Babies. There was a host of them, and it was not easy to keep them away from school. Even the tiniest creatures were brought along. Each child had its own nurse, and all wanted to be in school. So it was arranged that one girl should come in the morning and get a lesson, and then run home to mind child, and let the nurse come. But usually the one left behind would come on with the baby and wait around the house until relieved. She always brought with her a tin can with hominy for the child when hungry. It was not unusual for the little nurse to appear in her class as soon as it was called, having passed her baby along to any friend who was disengaged. There must have been some signal from the window, for a girl would ask, to step out for a minute, when the baby tender would return in her place. These babies needed but little care. Even the youngest would eat hominy when hungry, and then go to sleep. I have seen 8 and 10 of these little black creatures asleep on the piazza at a time. Usually the nurse would take off her apron and spread it down for baby to lie on. That was all. But at the best, babies were very confusing to the school. Finally, I engaged an old mamma to mind them during school hours. Now the little girls were happy. Each one brought her charge to Aunt Clara's house and left it on her way to school. It was pleasant to look in upon this primitive nursery and see these pickaninnies sitting upon the well-sanded floors or asleep in the corner. Dogs. Our greatest trial was the dogs. No colored man considered himself safe or even respectable without one or more miserable-looking curs. These always ran around after the children and darted into the schoolroom whenever the door was open. Then some one of the older people would call out, "Drive out that dog!" And there was a regular skirmish until he was ejected. In vain we talked and expostulated. It took time to make the scholars believe that we drew the line at dogs. One man said feelingly, "Why, if I left my little dog, I must stay too, for him ain't going to stop without me." Miss Lizzie. Now that field work was over, all the contrabands flocked to the school until the room was overcrowded. It took most of my time to enroll and place the newcomers. They appeared irregularly and at all times and seasons. "Please read me quick, ma'am. I's hasty. I's got a baby at home," said a big black woman. This is but a specimen of many other days. In vain did we struggle to bring order out of this confusion. In this dilemma, Miss Fanny signaled to her sister, "Come over and help us." And in due time, Miss Lizzie arrived. That was a day of jubilee to the contrabands. The children, laughing and shouting, surrounded the house and peeped into the windows. Miss Lizzie had to go out and be formally introduced before they dispersed. "Oh, but him just like Miss Fanny," said Sally, a sometimes waitress. The plantation school had now been united with mine, and the room was so crowded that often two of the teachers took their classes out under the trees, while a third gave oral instruction in the schoolroom. In order to teach writing, Miss Fanny had to let the scholars kneel down before the benches, upon which they placed their slates and books and papers. I was much interested in a class of married men and women who never got much beyond words of 2 syllables, and could only spell and write good, books, etc. I devoted the recess time to them, and was much amused by their efforts. They rolled up their eyes and scratched their heads when puzzled, and every line in their faces was in motion. If any one missed a word or gave a wrong answer, he looked very grave. But whenever a correct answer was given, especially if it seemed at all difficult, they laughed aloud and reeled about, hitting each other with their elbows. Such guffaws could not be tolerated in regular school hours. They joked each other like children, but, unlike them, they took all good-naturedly. One day some small boys were standing in a class reading. The first boy stumbled over the words, and the lesson was passed to the next, who read it correctly, over which he chuckled well, and number 1, much chagrined over his failure, said in a low voice, "Get out." At this, number 2 was highly incensed. Doubling up his fists, he exclaimed, "Him cuss me, get out, ma'am! Him cuss me, get out!" A boy gave a haphazard answer to a question in geography one day. His teacher exclaimed, "Why, Raph, how could you say that?" "Oh, Miss Fanny, a slip ob de tongue am no fault ob de brain," was his ready reply. An old man came to talk with us about his grandson, about whose progress in school he was anxious. "I tell you what, ma'am," he said, "Billy's a very tick-headed child, what you may call a no-count boy. But I wants him for larn sure. Do please, ma'am, take your leetle paddle," meaning ruler, "so him shall bring home something in his head." One morning 2 bright and clean little girls, 10 and 12 years of age, came and took their seats as soon as the bell rang. We soon heard the chirping of little chickens, and I asked if any one had chickens in the room, and there came a faint reply, "Yes, ma'am." "Who is it?" "Me, ma'am," said the older girl. "You, Virginia, where?" "In my bosom," she said slowly. "In your bosom? What in the world did you bring chickens to school for?" To which she tremblingly replied, "De old mudder, him kill all but 3 of him chickens, and Titty," meaning her stepmother, "say I must mind these, and I 'fraid if I lef 'em home, de rats will eat 'em, so I has to bring 'em wid me, lessen I can't come to school, ma'am." Sure enough, there were the 3 little creatures snugly nestled in the bosom of her frock. We soon found a box in which they could safely be kept until school was over. That was Chapter 6, My Parish, from First Days Amongst the Contrabands, by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett.